I guess as people come in, I can just introduce myself. So, hi everyone. My name is Cache Garland. I go to Villanova University. I'm a junior, English major as well. And on campus, I do a lot of activism, advocacy for minorities. So I'm in student government as a director of diversity, equity, inclusion. So that just entails for me to be an advocate for minoritized students on campus, help implement policies on campus that students feel like need to be done, or just to make general changes on campus for everyone to feel included and just part of feeling like the Villanova community, because that's what I struggled with for myself when I joined. And I'm also in VU Pride, which is the LGBTQ organization on campus. I'm the co-chair of that. So I took a lot of leadership roles, and I also recently over the summer was part of the Black Student Leader Demand Group. So we made a list of demands to send to the president of the university, as well as administration, for changes we wanted to see on campus for this upcoming semester and for the future. So that's just a little synopsis of things that I do and why I'm also here as well. So if we could just go around and just give little introductions about ourselves. I can just start by going by who I see first on my screen. So I'm sorry if I pronounce names wrong as well. But is it Rohal?
It's Rohil.
Rohil, okay, sorry.
Yeah, no worries at all. So my name is Rohil Salman. I am now a fifth year PhD student in history at the George Washington University. I am from Pakistan, and I am currently in Pakistan, where I was supposed to be for the past year conducting research, but then everything went online, so I'm still here. With regards to activism, I'll talk about this later when we do our 3 to 5 minute introduction, but I have been hampered by the fact that I am an international student in the US with regards to my activism. There have been a number of restrictions as to how much I can do that. But being an international student from a country that also has a lot of political and social problems, I've been involved on either side in the US as much as I can, and a lot of that back home as well, which might not be as relevant to academics and people in the US, but I just feel that that's something that, apart from just academic activism, a lot of social activism is something that I've been increasing over the past year or two while I have been in Pakistan for this long. So that's the introduction for what I do.
Thank you. Fen, would you like to go next?
Hi. I am, I guess it's officially Dr. Fen Kennedy. I'm just entered my second year in a faculty position at the University of Alabama. I did my PhD at The Ohio State University. I am a dance studies PhD, which means I teach both practical dance classes and history, critical theory, those kinds of things. When I was in Ohio, I had a long time to get established and to do activism socially within the community. In the university, I kind of co-founded an inclusive and accessibility board among the students, which helped to make dance classes more, or in any way, accessible for folks with disabilities. And I also led gender inclusive social dance classes for the wider community. Now I'm in Alabama. I have been scooped up by all the various diversity and equity boards that they can get me to participate on. And I also have worked with the Women's Gender and Race Studies folks down here to try and do more on the ground activism. Yes, there are, as Rahel said, there are things that being an immigrant you get, there are some significant roadblocks around what kinds of activism you can do. And I am interested in continuing to negotiate those as I go forward here.
Great, thank you so much. Evan?
Can you hear me all right? Excellent.
Yeah.
Hi everyone. I'm Evan Turiano. I'm a PhD candidate in U.S. history at the CUNY Graduate Center. I also work in a faculty support writing center role at LaGuardia Community College, and I'm an adjunct lecturer in history at Queens College, both also in the CUNY system. My research is not really related to our topic today. Instead, I work in early American history. I'm writing a dissertation about the political conflict over the legal rights of African Americans accused of being fugitive slaves and its role in the coming of the Civil War. But in the last several months, as everything sort of hit the fan, and we're trying to navigate teaching a few classes, I sort of pivoted away from my research into sort of some new research and sort of a series of articles on how the problems, long-term problems in the university system interact with things like policing, nativism, of course, the pandemic, technology, and sort of above it all, of course, capitalism. So, happy to talk about all that stuff today. Also, happy to sort of talk about the teaching and learning experience at the nation's biggest public university, one that's, in the ringer of some layoffs. I'm not sure if you saw in the news, we laid off, or rather not we, they will say laid off 3,000 adjunct lecturers this summer and are expecting more this winter. So happy to sort of talk about that from the student, teacher, and staff ends that I get to see on different days of the week.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. We can just dive straight into some of the questions that I have for you guys. The first one I have is, in an ideal world, how do you see your structures that promote equity being incorporated into universities, and what changes would you expect from universities? And anyone can just unmute themselves and just answer.
I can start to talk if that's okay. Sure. So I'm guessing that folks in this room aren't necessarily the most invested in learning how to do a practical dance class on a Zoom setting. So I'm going to stick mostly to my work doing history, if that's okay with you. And I think that when I tried to create my history class of the semester, I've taught history for years and years and years, but teaching it online, I wanted to really rethink not just the structure of the course in the light of the political moment that we're in now, but also my pedagogical methods. And when I thought about that, I was very much inspired by a writer called Jessica Zeller. And she wrote a fantastic article called Teaching for the End Times. And she said, why are we so arrogant as teachers that we think students can only learn when we are present? What if we took ourselves out of the equation? I was like, well, that's a challenge. Because often I want to guide my students towards not only historical knowledge, but also equity and activism and political awareness. And I sometimes think that that's my responsibility. So I thought, well, how much can I take myself out of the equation? Especially coming from the mindset of access, where some of my students couldn't be physically in the classroom, and asynchronous learning had to be the option versus synchronous at the same time learning that most of my students were doing. And actually Zoom lends itself quite well to this, because in a spatial hierarchical perspective, I'm not sat at the front and there's not a room of people looking at me. We're all in a space where we can look at each other or choose to look at each other. But my class now is restructured based on the technical limits of Zoom, which is that we use breakout rooms and people can mute me and people can choose their own adventure and have a discussion completely separate from where I am. And I think that rather than that just being a function of Zoom, I think that's something that we should adopt across universities, is the idea of giving students agency and giving students space to explore their own ideas and create their own knowledge. And maybe loosening our hand on the reins of how we guide that experience for them.
I'd be happy to pick that up. I think the biggest thing to come from restructuring in restructuring my classes in the face of all of this, for me, was just a new chance to think about the sort of tension in a college classroom between learning and assessment. That I think everyone who's in this virtual room who comes to something like this would probably agree that we should be there to try to foster a learning situation, right? And that assessment is more driven by credentialism that has to do with, the economics of the university and the place of a college degree in capitalism and stuff like that. And unfortunately, most of our students are sort of stuck in this in between, where they want to learn, but at the same time, they also have economic motives driving their decisions through and beyond college. And so I guess, having to build a class pretty much from the bottom up and teach online for the first time for me, and, rethink both, like Fen said, student meetings, the work being done over the course of a semester gave me a chance to, with each and everything sort of reassess, like, is this a learning opportunity, or is this me, slipping into the role of gatekeeper that the university expects me to play, but that I certainly don't want to be playing, and, maybe taking advantage of the fact that because the, administrators are running around with their heads cut off, they're not actually doing a ton of oversight and stuff, and, not freaking out about grading, not freaking out about the amount of sort of rigorous assessment work that's being turned in, and instead trying to sort of gear each interaction towards more meaningful learning.
Yeah, so I haven't had the opportunity to teach online yet. That's because I don't have teaching. Haven't had teaching duties for the past year, and I don't have any for this semester either. But even apart from online teaching, the major concern that I see with classrooms and equity, and especially as an international student, is about ESL students, right? Students who do not have English as their first language coming into these classrooms. It's a very intimidating experience. I count myself among a privileged group of people who, when I got to the US, I didn't have any problems with language. I didn't have any problems with communicating or writing. But then again, I came in at a much more advanced level than a lot of undergraduates do that I ended up teaching. And I have ended up teaching over the past 3 or 4 years. And I feel there is, at least where I've had this experience at GW, there has been this kind of stigma towards second language English students. And I do remember even in faculty meetings, this has been discussed that we need to reduce the number of people who are not completely comfortable with English in history courses, which at that point I saw as the faculty just saying that because they wanted to reduce the workload that they would have to do. As in increase the amount of work that they're doing because they need to carry on fixing their language and also teach them history at the same time. But now that I think back to it, I think it's kind of unfair that a lot of these students come in with certain expectations and they're thrown right into the deep end with basically very little help. I mean, academic writing centers exist and all those resources at universities do exist to assist them, but I don't think that's enough for a lot of people. And I've personally sometimes gone out of what my official duties are as a TA to help students with problems, especially students from Asia and other parts of the world that are not as comfortable speaking in English, will not take part in discussions, will not take part in other smaller activities. So you just have to keep, and I don't think there's a hard and fast rule as to how you can run a classroom like that, but you need to keep adjusting however everybody else in the classroom is comfortable with that as well. And that's a pretty big challenge because then you don't have a very set, rigorous, syllabus or a way that you go about your classroom, because I've seen that change every semester that I've taught so far in the US. And every semester I have a very different pool of students. Some of them, in some semesters I've had classrooms where the entirety of the classroom is American, so they're all on a level playing field. And in some semesters I've had more international students than I've had American students. And that just creates a very difficult dynamic in freshman classrooms, which I think is something that doesn't get talked about enough and often, but is something that we really need to think strongly about when we're talking about equity within learning, especially for newer students.
Can I push back for a second on one of those ideas, which is that all American students are on a level playing field with English?
Yeah.
Because I think there's a huge diversity in English skills and English like writing skills in particular. And I think one of the things that's concerned me always with ESL students, who I've worked with quite a lot, is the grading push towards standardization rather than fluency. In that the prestige dialect of the US and also the UK is a very static form of English that not a lot of people speak and write. And so when we push people towards being assessed on their writing, and I don't know if it's the same with you two, but history also becomes the writing course rather than anything else. So history is where they're tested on their writing skills. If we are pushed to grade them on the conformity of their writing towards the standardized prestige dialect of English that's spoken in a given country, we're actually not supporting their fluency or their expression or their development of historical learning and thought. And so, yeah, I full on now, my syllabus says I'm grading you on fluency and not your adherence to a standardized dialect, in part because it's very racist to say that, like, this dialect and no other dialect. Like, if it is fluent, if the ideas are comprehensible, if they are expressed eloquently, and I can read them, that to me satisfies that they have sophisticated writing skills. Like, let's just throw standardization of English out as a criteria that we expect students to conform to.
No, I completely agree with that. I don't think that, sorry, Shay.
Oh, I was going to ask a follow-up question. I'm sorry. I was just going to say, like, from a student perspective, like, Fen, how would you expect students to, like, international students to feel about that? Like, do you see there's a trend as if there's a certain sort of, like, preference for wanting to write in that sort of way or wanting to learn in that sort of way of learning the natural dialect? Or do you feel like they rather be able to express themselves and have that option of just freedom?
Yeah. I think there is a split the difference that has to go on. When they are in a history class, the idea that they will be graded on fluency alone usually results in a huge sigh of relief and much more confident papers. But I also think that, Rahel, you make a great point. Academic language support is catastrophically lacking at universities. And, like, students do understand that a privileged dialect exists and they will be penalized in certain settings because prejudice also exists if they can't speak it. So combining these are the tools you need if you want to code switch into this privileged dialect, but it doesn't exist, it doesn't impact how you are graded as a writer and a thinker and someone who can express themselves fluently. So I think separation cachet is what I go for, and trying to make sure that they have the tools to switch if they want to switch, but I am not going to impose it on them as a requirement for saying, can you write?
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to say about just that topic?
Yeah, I would agree with all of, I think agree especially on that topic of sort of those holding those two ideas in our head at once regarding the sort of relationship between fluency and the expectations of international students, because it's a difficult one. You know, it's a point that Rahil raised, that sometimes, you know, if a student is seeking out you know, formal writing remediation, sometimes an intro history class might be the closest setting they can find to getting, you know, expectation of hours of help. And then, yeah, no, I mean, I guess it's a tough problem that I guess I don't have any coherent answers to, except to sort of try to meet students where they are, you know, try to separate in my own head what is sort of useful for them versus, you know, again, what am I, you know, what implicitly am I holding as a gatekeeping thing that isn't necessary to their, you know, personal, academic, or professional futures. And then, of course, trying to sort of balance that all in the, you know, at the same time as teaching what's usually like a survey type of history class where, you know, you're trying to do all of this and also whatever burn through 400 years of history is a difficult problem. And I guess, you know, I think, you know, there might not be an immediate answer. It might be a question that is semester to semester and student to student, but I guess it's probably one of those that if a instructor is reckoning with it, then they're probably already, like, you know, 3/4 of the way towards finding the answer.
And I think a lot of that has to do with, and this is very much a personal preference or a personal belief that I hate academic jargon, and when kids join in, like for instance, English as second language students join in a freshman history survey course, and they're like blasted with words like even pedagogy or epistemology and everything like that. I just feel like it's a very different world that they're stepping into then, and something that they haven't been prepared for before, and something that they're not going to learn from that. And there needs to be a more progressive approach towards when they get there. I think it's more important for them to be able to express their ideas in whatever way, language that they feel comfortable expressing them in. And once they're able to do that, that's when you go on and then you start putting in the academic language that you need to use in your writing or even when you're speaking. And that's the unevenness that I was talking about in classrooms with American students and non-American students. That's the one thing that I noticed, that a lot of American students would be familiar with a lot of this jargon that we use and these theoretical buzzwords that we tend to use even unconsciously sometimes when we're teaching. And most of the international students would actually come up to me and ask me what those words are after class. And I think this happened to me 2 or 3 times. And after that, I made a very concerted effort to not engage these students in words that I think back to my freshman year in undergrad, and I wouldn't get any of those words, right? So I don't want them to feel excluded from any discussion that's going on in the classroom. So I just feel that that's progression that needs to be smoothed out a lot more, rather than just throwing them in right from the start.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely hear a lot of just like repetition of just like being inclusive and just not sort of treating international students as kind of like an other, but in a way of just incorporating them more in the classroom, allowing them to feel more comfortable around American students as well, and trying to find that medium between giving them the academic experience, but also just giving them the natural progression into becoming just a regular student as well, sort of experience in that balance. And so my question is, why do you think we still see like these exclusive teaching and admission processes and practices, even when universities say they are committed to diversity?
I feel like I've talked a lot, but may I jump in again? Because
Yeah.
it links directly to what we were just discussing. And this time I will talk about practical dance. We audition students into our program. And the practical audition is much more important than the academic standards or the letters. And we look for ballet, and we look for contemporary dance, and we look for jazz. Ballet has a long history of exclusion, whether or not that's historically supported or not. And so we keep saying we have to diversify our program, we have to diversify our audition requirements, we have to make sure that students without a long ballet background who have like a lot of training in other forms of dance can come in. And yet the audition requirements came out for their virtual auditions, and the requirements for ballet were listed, and they were given almost entirely in French terminology. And the specialized terms for the technique were used, and students were required to do things at a very high level. I said, well, that's just slamming the gate down even further. If we usually we would at least demonstrate in front of them. So can we have a video demonstration of these things so that students who are trying to make a recording of themselves can actually have something to follow? And I think, so people keep saying they're committed to diversity and equity and inclusion, and the greatest frustration is their refusal to make radical change in order to do so. They want to take the model that existed and shift it towards a more diverse place. And what I really think they need to do is take the model, go, okay, that doesn't work. What are we going to do? And be really willing to do something that is completely different and abandon the cachet of historical tradition in order to build something that works.
I'd be happy to sort of talk about this international student thing in sort of a slightly different, from a different perspective of like the university level. And I unfortunately got to jump in a little bit too late, but this came up in the previous session as well. But the really problematic relationship that universities have built with international students from like a revenue perspective. So this is something I did a little writing on this summer, that between, you know, basically what has happened in American universities and even in public universities in a lot of ways is, you know, the 10-20% cuts that we've seen in state spending between the 90s and today, you know, still far below, and you know, things that were accelerated in 2008. Schools have started to replace with this sort of model of trying to treat a large base of international students as purely a revenue generator, you know, and I've one number here from 10 years ago, international student tuition dollars made up 28% of state university revenue, and now it's a full 40%. It's a massive increase, but it's been really sort of done in bad faith, and it's, you know, it's about shifting the relationship between colleges and international students entirely for the worse. You know, it's this very front end thing, and colleges love to, you know, tout a vision of multiculturalism that you see on the pamphlets and stuff, but students, international students, as you know, we've all seen in the classroom anecdotally, get very little in the end of sort of back end support from universities, you know, when they are treated as sort of a base of tuition dollars rather than as a part of a more equitable community. And then the other problem, I think, something that I've seen working in, you know, faculty support for writing and you know, in and around writing centers and prepping sort of classroom writing assignments, is that I just sort of know it for that track, you know, for like college writing, but I know it exists in sort of all tracks of pedagogy, that we tend to treat international students as like sort of like a single stamp prescription, right? It's like, here's how you teach students to write, and here's how you teach international students how to write. And it's, you know, it's sort of a singular funnel. And you know, Fen made the point earlier that, you know, this is just, you know, all of our students have individual, you know, needs, goals, expectations, and that anytime we try to do these sort of broad blanket prescriptions, we're probably approaching it wrong.
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that's like very prominent is the fact that it seems like the universities just aren't doing enough for international students. They're not allowing them to, again, just feel like included by, like you said, Finn, like having things where it's for every single level of a student. It's not just for, okay, if you're in this level, like you're going to understand this, and if you're in this level, you're going to struggle. Or the fact that international students are treated as commodities and are not seen more as just being just students. They're seen as revenue, gaining money for the, you know, university and things like that. So just like a follow-up question is just, what do chronic issues with diversity reveal about universities and their connection with students? There is a clear disconnect between universities and students, and I think that's something that we should definitely just dive into and just think about, why is that? Where is that coming from?
I think in a lot of cases that the visibility of the faculty is a very major component in doing that. So, for instance, the department that I'm in, you would have almost a 90% white faculty. When you see that as an international student or as any person of color or a minority, and you see that there is nobody up there who looks like you, who talks like you, who's been through similar experiences as you are currently going through, it is a bit alienating. And I speak about this as a personal experience that I've had at university in the US doing graduate school. Even though it's at a more advanced stage, when you get there, there's very little guidance. There is very little in the way of assisting international students to fit in the broader community. And that affects a lot of things. So that the fact that I wasn't as well adjusted in the first semester that I got here really affected how I was in the classroom and how I was teaching, because I had very little knowledge of how a classroom works in a US university. I'd never been here before. I'd had my undergraduate in Pakistan, and I read and wrote and was graded very differently. So in my first semester here, when I had no guidance about how to teach or what to teach and how to grade, I ended up, so this was very sad and embarrassing, but I ended up handing out like 20 D grades on the first assignment that I had given out to my students, because I graded them according to how I was graded my entire life. And I had no guidance how to do that in a new setting. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the faculty didn't share my experience, but even within the department itself with other graduate students, they didn't share my experience either, because there's a severe lack of diversity in both those areas, which the university needs to address. And even though a bottom-up change would be ideal, I think starting at the top would not be a bad idea either, because that's the most visible aspect of where you see that representation happening.
I actually want to return to the question about the disconnect between faculty and students. And I want to be really explicit that I am not just talking about international students, although I'm including them. I'm talking about students who face all different kinds of marginalization within the university system, and that particularly includes Black students and LGBTQIA students and disabled students. And I think that one of the biggest problems that faculty are having right now, and I spoke about the desire to do slow shifts, is an unwillingness to listen to and believe those students about what they need and their experiences. And I say this as someone who's in the middle of trying to help a diversity and inclusion committee get formed. And one of the things that I've done is going and looking at different research around the different committees around the community who are doing that kind of work. Most of them don't have an undergraduate voice on those committees, and they don't have an undergraduate liaison. Diversity efforts are being restricted to faculty, or you have 10 faculty and 2 students, and undergraduate voices are getting drowned out in those settings. So making an opportunity for undergraduate voices in particular to speak and be heard, but also believed about what they need, and things like willingness to make simple changes. For example, some things like I am the only transgender faculty member in our department. I'm the only non-binary person most of our students have ever met. It took a very long time for me to have a bathroom where I could change between classes, converted, even though there was a single-use one. So the chair announced that we would no longer be requiring gendered dress codes on our syllabi this semester, but the faculty haven't followed those instructions or changed. The chair also said that faculty should be using their pronouns in their Zoom announcements, but the faculty don't do it, and in fact, neither does she. So the idea of paying lip service to the things that students say they want, or that faculty say they want, the students say, we would like a more diverse curriculum. And when it comes to the moment where we propose new courses, do any courses get proposed that diversify the curriculum? Like the willingness to hear a problem, believe the problem exists, and act on it in the now, right now. No, not in 2 semesters when you've logistically set it up, or no, not when you've tried the thing you think you wanted to try, but just actually believe what people are saying they need and do it.
Yeah, and this is, I think, will just be sort of reiterating what my co-panelists have said here very, very well. But I think, it all comes, the problems here all sort of come down to the college as a business, Unlike, say, the 1970s, I think right now, if you were to poll college presidents, they would all say they're for diversity and inclusion. But when colleges approach that stuff, it's coming from marketing, it's coming from the trustees, it's coming from sort of a particular desire to sort of remake the public facing image of the university, you know, and it's not then, and so then all the things, you know, right, colleges have sort of this thin veneer on top that the public sees and that people see when they're applying and giving and stuff, but then we know the sort of things that are happening inside, and that involves, you know, the relationship between faculty and students, the actual student experience, and none of the commitment to diversity and inclusion and equity is reaching that stuff, because it's being driven by, you know, that's how we find ourselves in this really sort of puzzling situation where, you know, 40% of the country is like, oh, colleges are a bastion of Marxism, and you know, people running around doing all sorts of crazy stuff, but then we know them to be sort of fundamentally conservative places when you live and operate within them. It's because of this weird image reality thing that's sort of driven by the college as a business.
I think it's so interesting to hear like the same frustrations that you all have that mirror what I have as a student advocate myself, because I feel like a lot of times when I do mention certain initiatives like trying to get like an LGBTQ resource center on campus, it's always like, where's the money? You know, like, where's the money? Or that's not going to happen now. It's going to happen 5 years from now. And there's never like that push to think about, okay, well, if you're saying this is going to happen 5 years from now, what are we going to do now then to kind of set up for that happening? You know, like, I understand we're not going to get it in tomorrow, but okay, so what are we going to do today? Like, what's the alternative to that? And I feel like that's what universities tend to miss, especially when it comes from student initiatives. And I feel like a lot of times they rely on student initiatives. So just for the Black student leaders, we felt like we were the ones doing all the work by ourselves, and the university was just waiting for us to do something. Or they were giving the work to the people who are already doing it, you know, not really giving it to other people who need to listen, you know, not expanding the conversation. So I think just hearing that, you know, as a student, I'm not the only one who notices that as well. You know, seeing that faculty notice it, because I think it's so important to have faculty backing students for this, because usually it's students fighting for it by themselves, or we don't know where to turn to, especially for LGBTQ issues when there's not a lot of LGBTQ staff, or just people of color issues when there's not a lot of people of color. I go to a predominantly white institution, so it's very rare for me to find another person of color on this campus who's a faculty and staff or professor or anything. So I just want to like get that out there. Like, I completely understand. I get it 100% just as a student. But I thank all of you for your answers. It just opened my eyes to a lot, and just makes me feel better knowing that I'm not alone in this fight as a student. But I wanted to turn and open it up to any audience questions that anyone has as well. Before, Ben, you can go before.
I just wanted to check on something in response to what Evan said about the shiny veneer on top. And I love your image of like diversity and equity initiatives being for the public, and not for the people actually affected by them. But I will say that being down in Alabama, there's a very interesting thing where Alabama is very conscious of its racial history, and actively working to present a shiny veneer that addresses that. Alabama is not conscious of its LGBTQ prejudice, or rather, there isn't, like, that is not allowed to reach the shiny public-facing veneer at all. So diversity initiatives, all the ones that reach the public face, are geared towards socially acceptable in Alabama issues, which means that there's a huge inequity of like funding and willingness to address questions. The most heartbreaking example was on the Transgender Day of Remembrance last year, which is a vigil for all the trans people who have been murdered in the past year. The university, the College of Arts and Sciences, held a celebration of diversity of performance that had no interest in trans or LGBTQ issues. And it was fully funded. They put on this giant buffet spread, and I went and like over on the other side of the campus, the LGBTQ organization was passing around kind of candles that they'd scavenged and sandwiches from a conference the day before, like remembering the dead on campus. And it just made me want to cry. Like the gap between like what kinds of issues get noticed and what kinds don't. And it is that shiny veneer that you were talking about, Evan. Like if diversity initiatives are for the public eye, it's always going to control like what we can actually do, and it's always going to be shaped by the bubble around the university, which is usually substantially more conservative even than the university itself.
Yeah, no, that's a great perspective, and I think a valuable one coming from I guess if the university itself is always going to lag beyond its shiny veneer, at least in New York we can get like a decent veneer, but to really protect our students in different environments, really sort of emphasizes how to approach that. And before we jump to questions, if it's okay, I just wanted to shout out Cachet and student activists from the faculty perspective. You all do such incredible work and are in such a uniquely difficult position because, you mentioned the timeline issue of, 5 years from now, colleges are great at throwing things into committees and mucking up the gears and waiting for you all to graduate out, and hoping that, maybe the next class to come in won't complain so much. And, you all have to balance, we get to, we're here, we get to sort of deal with things year to year while you all have degrees to try to get, all this sort of, all these other externalities. So to be able to find time to try to improve your environment, with the knowledge that you might not get to see most of the positive changes is really admirable from our point of view.
Students give us permission to take the risks.
That's great. Yeah, that's very well put.
Thank you. I definitely appreciate just from a student perspective, because it is very exhausting. That's what I found myself when I was jumping into this work a lot over the summer. It's exhausting when you don't have a backing, and it's exhausting hearing the same thing. Oh, years from now after you graduate. And it's I want to see the changes now. I want to see the changes while I'm here for 4 years. I don't feel comfortable here. So let me feel comfortable while I'm here for 4 years. Do something for me now, not later. But that's just my final thought about that. I just thank you all so much for everything that you had to say.
Thank you.
And I think Kushi had a hand raised. If we can move towards more audience questions, you can use the raise hand function or
Hi. So I don't have a question. I just wanted to add a couple things to the really interesting debate here on ESL, because so this year I was an undergraduate in the US, and now I'm a graduate student in Europe, and I'll be a level of pretty significant experience. And I liked a lot of the points that were raised here, and it's not a debate that's had enough on most American university campuses. But there's a couple of things that I wanted to add, and one was the thing that we didn't discuss was the nexus between American universities and the American immigration system, and how you could get admitted to a US university without any kind of English fluency requirements, and you still wouldn't get there, and you wouldn't be issued a visa without being able to show a certain level of fluency to the immigration officer who's going to approve you to leave. So that's the first thing. And as I was listening to this discussion, I thought I would be pretty heavily on the side of everybody who's advocating for, more support for international students than I am. But I also think on another level that sometimes such a perspective can be really infantilizing for a lot of us. You know what? I mean, I didn't go to the US to get the same familiar and safe experience that I would have gotten in a university in my own country. I went there to be pushed and challenged from the first day, and I was, and it was really hard. But I'm glad that I was. And again, English is not my first language either, but I don't think I think it can be a pretty binary debate when we start saying things like we should accommodate international students because they need, more support because they may not come with a similar level of fluency in English that American students would go. I think at some level, we also have to raise the level of public debate and expectation on all of our campuses. And I think the expectation for fluency in English and to be able to communicate with that common medium. And I went to a university where you also have to speak a second language, but to be able to communicate in a common medium, I think that's really important. And I know that I wouldn't have the university experience that I had in the US and that I'm having in Europe without that. So I hope that's a dimension of the debate that I could add to this.
Yeah, thank you for that. I also wanted to say, I laughed a lot because I got put into, when I came to America, I got put into the international student, you will need a lot of support in English category, despite the fact that English is my first language. and so I kind of cracked the system a little. But I also think that in the US, folks aren't as aware of how fluent many students are required to be in English, and how proficient they are. I went on tour in Norway, and when they found out I couldn't speak Norwegian, the teachers switched the whole class over to English because they could guarantee that every other student in the room spoke English better than I could Scrabble in Norwegian. And that idea of dual language fluency, I wish it's one that more English and American universities would adopt, because as you say, like, it can be infantilizing to be assumed that, like, you can't speak a foreign language when like you probably speak 5.
That's great. No, I really appreciate both of your points, and to sort of take them one at a time. The first one, the sort of nexus between the university and the university system. I think that is really, I think it's just really sort of, especially, you know, in our current moment, and with a few months ago, the ICE directive really sort of exacerbates what happens when colleges, you know, treat international students as a category of revenue generation, but don't really have any real expectation of sort of treating them equally among other students, is that they're going to not only, you know, maybe have a less than positive college experience, X, Y, and Z, all these things we've discussed, but it also means universities might be fundamentally unable to protect them from right-wing demagogues who assume power. You know, that's what I think we saw when all these colleges, for a sort of frightening moment, had to face down this decision. Are we going to, you know, put our whole campus communities at risk, or are we going to lose this revenue? What are we, you know, it leads them, yeah, it leaves us, you know, fundamentally unable to protect all of our students equally. And then to your second point, I think that's also, you know, very, very well taken. And I think, you know, this is what I tried to raise. And again, it's difficult, especially when instructors are resource strapped and have hundreds of students. But I think it's a matter of, you know, we're almost always going to be steered wrong if we, you know, and this was like, you know, Fenn's point, if we're trying to treat international students categorically, we're almost always going to do wrong, rather than, you know, doing what we can within our resources to treat all of our students individually. Because, you know, yeah, like Fenn said at the beginning, you know, oftentimes, you know, if you're trying to just judge, you know, who's going to need writing help, who's going to need fluency help just based off of who's international and who's not, you're probably not going to have sort of a great understanding of your classroom community.
Yeah, I'll quickly jump in here, because I think that one of the important things, and this is a comment, and I think some practical things that we need to keep into mind when we are in a classroom setting. I think there is an expectations when it comes to participation, that if one is vocal in the classroom, then one is participating, and which ties back again to the question of fluency. But might we think here of parallel modes of participation, which makes the classroom an inclusive space? For instance, I'm thinking of, you know, we could have in the classroom somebody taking notes for each of the classes, and that itself shows a mode of engagement. Or, you know, there is maybe a class library, and there are students who are contributing to that in creating a set of readings that is relevant for all. So when I'm saying that, you know, creating this parallel models of participation, it's not something which is specifically targeted for international students, but also draws in other students who might not always feel comfortable participating vocally in a classroom setting, right? And also, I think this is again tied to the question of ableism, which is sort of important when we talk about radical pedagogy. So I'm curious. I mean, a lot of the conversation that happened in this panel was about international students, but I'm wondering that what would be the connection between, you know, engagement, pedagogy, and ableism? Because I know that when I'm on Zoom, it's very hard for me to have my camera on all the time. And there is some sort of an understanding that if you have your video on, you're engaged. But that basically, again, points out to the carceral logic that JC referred in the earlier session. So any thoughts that connects on like ableism and disability rights would be much appreciated.
Sutama, thank you so much for your question. I'm going to jump in because this is something I'm quite passionate about. So on the first day of my classes, I explained to my students a theory called comlag. And comlag is how long it takes you to process information, formulate your answer, and respond. And I ask my students to rate themselves as a fast comlag person or a slow comlag person. And I explain how in the past, fast comlag has typically been correlated with intelligence and active participation, and slow comlag has typically been correlated with laziness, stupidity, not understanding, disengagement. And then I throw that system out the window. And I explain that, like, in this classroom, we're setting up a model where the length of time it takes you to, like, formulate your ideas and what you need to be able to participate does not correlate to your level of, like, I'm not going to assess that as your level of engagement. I'm not going to assess that as to what extent you are engaged. So we do have a lot of different structures in the classroom for different modes of participation. But you're absolutely right. It is a question of ableism also. And like, sorry, I had such a clear thought and then it slipped away. But yes, that is where I start in terms of participation and just actually breaking down the system of the person with their hand raised at the front of the class all the time is the most engaged and has the most grasp of the material, because that is simply wrong.
Yeah, and to reiterate a point I think that Fen made at the beginning of this, it's thinking about how to reimagine participation in a class is maybe one of the few silver linings of the pandemic and all of this. I'm in the seminar this semester is actually my first time teaching like a non big intro survey. I'm teaching like a seminar based class, and it's actually really reinvigorating seeing, how many more students I have participating enthusiastically when they can either, do so audioly in the live session, or they can, ask questions in the chat of the session, or they can participate in our asynchronous discussion board. There's just like now, different questions being asked in different venues at different speeds with sort of different levels of commitment that I think allow a lot more students to comfortably engage. And so, I don't have an answer yet, except that I know that I want to spend the rest of the semester thinking about, how am I going to continue to make this work once I'm back in the classroom.
Yeah, I think fluency is just one of the issues that a lot of students face. Like, I think, my other fellow panelists have already mentioned, there's a number of reasons why students don't speak up, or some speak up more than others, etc. And I think that then again goes to the level of accommodating as many people as you can within that. I've had students who felt better participating if I broke the class up into smaller groups, because then they felt less of an anxiety to speak in front of 30 people instead of speaking in front of 5 people. I've encouraged students to see me after class if they have questions, not just in office hours, whether it's walking out of the class, whether it's packing up, whatever, if they feel comfortable just having a one-on-one conversation about it. And like I mentioned earlier, I haven't had the opportunity to teach online yet, but I would assume that this technology that we're going to be using now is going to be pretty useful, but it's also going to take a lot of time for the teachers and the instructors to fully manifest the power of this technology, to use it in order to make the classroom a more inclusive space for everybody involved over there. But I do think it's a pretty positive step.
I found my thought again. May I finish it? So when we got to the question of ableism, I was going to say that one of the things that Zoom doesn't have are established cultural and social norms. And I think one of the things that we can resist in terms of radical pedagogy is imposing the same norms of a, to use term, meat space or a real flesh space classroom. If we resist imposing those norms on Zoom, we can have an atmosphere that is like so much more inclusive of people. in terms of their need to turn their video off. Like, if we stop saying that I need to see your face in order to understand that you are here, I am going to trust that you are here, as evidenced by like your text on the screen, your like words in our collaborative class document. But also, I'll just tell a little story. My grad students, I was teaching a lecture to them, and I asked a question that, and they are in a grad office, and I am teaching remote. And I asked a question that stumped them, and they looked, and they kind of got this gleam in their eye, and then they muted themselves. And I could see them having this like radically, like this very passionate discussion that I, as their lecturer, was not allowed to participate in. I was like, that is one of the ballsiest power moves I have seen in a long time. And to have students do that was quite fantastic. I was like, okay, like there's a norm of consent that I want to just shift here. If you need a minute, I'll give you a minute, but you can totally mute yourselves and take that privacy. And I'm seeing Jesse's class in the chat, like how do we, question in the chat, one of the things I do to say, don't look at this crazy liberal professor's syllabus, is I always give options. So my students can engage with this thing, this thing, this thing, this thing, and follow their own curiosity. Which means that if they don't want to engage with some of the more radical things, they also have a different option. On my syllabus this week, one of the discussions was about the racial and sexual politics of WAP. And I knew exactly when a group was discussing that, because I would walk in and they would blush and they would go silent. I was like, you're on question 3. Do you want me to leave? And they'd be like, so I would leave. And I think this, like, suddenly, radically, in the classroom, students have privacy to discuss their more political ideas in a way that they don't feel is being shaped and guided by the imposition of a professor's politics. So I think that is, I've just tracked us in a different direction, but that's one way that I both like give more space for different kinds of participation and also keep myself safe from accusations of you are imposing your ideology on students.
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, I've been, fortunate that I think it was something that I was, again, being in New York, I was, when I first started teaching, afraid of, and I've found every semester my students have just been like super glad to follow me sort of as far left as we'll go, and we'll just sort of keep that train going. But I think that that's a really astute point, and it it speaks to sort of a more general pedagogical practice that students are going to be more willing to follow you if the experience in the classroom is sort of them going somewhere themselves rather than just sitting and listening to you, taking them there in lecture, in a sort of one-way expression of knowledge. So that is true of political stuff. That is true of just things to be learned that are less political, and is just really good practice that again, in a weird way, some of our new technological distance has opened some doors to, and I think once we figure out how to get it back into a face-to-face setting, it will be good. But it's it's just a sort of weird time for us all to come into it.
Although with a slight exception, I have found out that students won't say racism unless you've said racism first.
Interesting.
Like they need permission to call out that like they'll dance around it and they'll give every indication that they want to say it. If you haven't given them permission to say it by modeling it, they're not going to say it. It feels too dangerous in classrooms right now, and I'm really sorry that that's the case.
There's another question in the chat. I see that the person who put it is unmuted if they wanted to speak to it.
Hey, thank you. So I am gonna address this question that we received on email, but I want to stay on a little bit the thread of ableism here, because as someone who is disabled, going to conferences and talking to people in the same room where like there are 20, 30, 40 other conversations happening at the same time is like an impossible task for me. I don't do it. I can't hear you. It will not end well. I will end up either agreeing that your paper was terrible, or I will end up on like 6 committees so that I have no idea what are happening, right? Like, it's not a good idea. So doing this conference on Zoom and doing it, you know, on a weekend, again, the access of someone who works full time outside of the academy, this has, you know, the shift to Zoom has made things much more accessible in terms of an ability thing, but also in terms of scheduling and life outside of academia. So I just want to say thank you for this opportunity to come together in this space. But the question that we received on email here is there something that students, professors, et cetera, can do to correct for the trends that we see towards like rigid policy adherence that we also see as, you know, as scholars of history as part of a shift towards authoritarianism and fascism?
Well, I think the first piece of that second question is for us, you know, I've not a role I expected to play and in both this conversation and sort of in the semester as a whole is as someone who sort of appreciated the new technologies of distance learning. I tend to sort of be a skeptic of that stuff, and I think the carceral and surveillance technologies are where the skepticism comes right back for me. You know, I think there's this really, I think of the ed tech industry as being a really pernicious one, and one to be extremely skeptical of. You know, I think one of the, I think, you know, Bill Gates being sort of the biggest champion of educational technology, and particularly surveillance-based educational technology, being the new education czar in New York City, is a really sort of bad and dangerous development. And I think the first thing that we can do as instructors is sort of, to the limits of what we're permitted to do, or even to the limits of what we'll get caught doing, like to resist using that sort of technology, you know, like literally called panopto and stuff like that. You know, just to really carefully examine everything that we call an assessment, right? And be like, in what way is this a necessary learning tool? You know, and what am I doing as sort of an assessment for assessment's sake, and stripping all of those things away. Because at the end of the day, like, why, I don't think any of us find it as part of our educational mission to play into the role of gatekeeper, like, oh, you know, only so many of these degrees can get given out, and, you know, only so many of these passing grades can get given out. I don't think any of us want to play that role. And so to the extent that's again, and recognizing, you know, that as a contingent faculty member, you know, I'm lucky to be, you know, that at least in my most immediate level, which is the department I teach in, I'm extremely well supported and given an extreme amount of autonomy. But you know, that's where the oversight happens. But I know that's not true for many or most contingent faculty members. So, you know, they're probably constricted in their sort of ability to resist assessment and surveillance. But I think we have an obligation to sort of do so to the limits of our ability.
One thing that I've been playing with for the last couple of semesters is if I have to assess students, my students collaborate with me on designing the grading scheme. So we take a day at the beginning of the class and we decide, like, what do you want to be assessed on? Like, how is that going to show up in your work? Like, what's that going to entail? And one of the things where that really shows up that's going to speak towards ableism, I think, as well, is we talk about what the attendance criteria should be. And we talk about, like, what participation looks like. And most students come in with a very disciplinary or carceral mindset. Like, but attendance means you come at the right time every day, all the time, and you smile and you raise your hand. And I remember having a breakthrough moment when I said, what does a good citizen look like on a bad day? And that semester, the first criteria that students had to meet to get their quote unquote citizenship grade was an exceptional citizen advocates for and takes care of their own needs. Which was a huge change. And I still met the criteria of giving them a citizenship grade that was attuned to professionalism. But I did it in a way that actually supported the professional world that exists, and that we want to create. Because I think oftentimes when we assess students like students, we treat them in a way that's completely different from what they will be expected to do as professionals. Like as a professional, you're not expected to show up at your desk on the time, all the time, every day, and smile. You're expected to call in ahead if you're going to be late or sick. So why don't we change that and make that the expectation for students? Like if you're a professional, you're not going to be expected to make up work on your weekends. You're going to be expected to like do what you can to like catch up in the time that you've got. So like let's actually start reflecting start teaching students like they are adults rather than teaching them like we're trying to train them into discipline.
Just want to say that's great. I'm totally, if you know, with your permission, calling my participation grade a citizenship grade next semester and fundamentally restructuring what it entails. And
yeah,
you know,
I actually have a doc that I put together of classroom policies that includes some of that. If you shoot me an email, I'll send it over.
I absolutely will. Thank you.